And there's another bone.
To my relief, at least some bones have survived.
Well, there's the lower jaw. Looks intact. That doesn't look as if it's crushed. I'm amazed at the condition of this skeleton. When we first saw the coffin, I expected that whatever was inside it was going to be crushed, flat as a pancake. But the skeleton's in almost perfect condition. Even the skull, the most fragile part.
Locked away within the well-preserved bones may be chemical signatures, clues about this person's background, their life, and even their ancestry.
I take it you've managed to extract some DNA from the teeth, have you? Because
DNA is made up of 4 chemical bases known by the letters A, C, G and T. They're strung together in a chain 3 billion letters long, within which the precise order of the letters is crucial. To look at relationships between people, Helen is using a small section of ancient DNA, 400 letters long.
And what we can see at the top here is a sequence from European. It's actually the most common sequence in Europe. We call that the reference sequence. And underneath that, I'm looking at the same section from the female from Bath, the DNA that I extracted. And when we look at this section, well, actually, she's exactly the same. So there's an A here in our European sequence, and also an A here in our Bath female. There's a C up here and a C here, and this continues right through the length of the sequence.
So T3 A's and a G, T3 A's and a G. Right. So she is definitely European. But what about the man? Where does he come from?
The third line is the male from Bath. Male was definitely a bit different, and actually when we look on the screen here we can see where he's different in one of the spots. So we looked across. Here in our European reference we've got a T. We're looking at exactly the same place in our female from Bath. Well, she's got a T as well. But now looking at that same spot in our male from Bath, he's got a C there. So he's got a different letter there in his DNA sequence.
But does one little difference like this make that much of a change?
Well, in isolation, no it doesn't, but if you think there's a few changes on such a short region of DNA, and then there are 3 billion bases and covering that region to have changes in, well, start to see there can be quite a lot of changes and a lot of differences between people.
So he's definitely not European then? The sequence just doesn't fit?
No.
So where is he from?
Well, of course, that was the question I was asking, so I went and trawled through our database trying to find some matches. Here's one of them. There's the T we were looking up in our normal European, and a C here in this one that I found a match with, and the C in our male from Bath. But this guy is not from Europe at all. This guy's from Syria.
From Syria?
People with this sequence are found right throughout the Middle East and North Africa.
Now,
but not Britain.
Does this mean that he came from North Africa?
Actually, what it means is his ancestors did, and more specifically his maternal ancestors. What this is saying is that his mother or his mother's mother, the female line, came from North Africa or the Middle East.
And you can tell all that just from the odd change in the letter, just change in the DNA.
So how did this man, whose ancestry lay somewhere in the Middle East or North Africa, end up in Bath in the late 4th century? Britain was on the edge of the Roman world, but its wealthy inhabitants still wanted the luxuries of life. Exotic spices, silks and glassware were manufactured or traded in the Middle East and North Africa and were brought to Britain along well-established trading routes. And sometimes the traders who brought these goods stayed on to live in Britain. This tombstone in South Shields is of the wife of Barathes, a wealthy silk merchant from the city of Palmyra in Syria. So perhaps it was trade that brought our man across the empire to end his days in Bath.
I'm always intrigued to see what one of these faces you built's like, but I think this one I'm even more intrigued than usual because of all the hints that we've got about where this person might have come from.
Yeah.
There were hints when you were looking at the skull, weren't there, that he was going to be something a bit different.
Yeah,
so
he
has he turned out to be a bit different?
Yeah, he's unusual, and I think that the face is certainly not an average face.
It's such a big face, isn't it? You've reconstructed the faces of a lot of Egyptian mummies, haven't you?
Yeah.
How would he fit in with that? I mean, would you have been surprised if he'd come from an Egyptian mummy?
Not at all. There's a lot of characteristics that are similar. This slight prognathism, but also the downward sloping nasal spine that you often see with ancient Egyptians. This ambiguity about the racial origins when you look at the skull, that's all very common in ancient Egyptians. So if you told me he was Egyptian, I wouldn't be very surprised.
I mean, this is just another bit of evidence, really, because everything so far has pointed in this direction. The isotopes, the DNA, and
Very
now,
consistent,
yes, and now you're saying even his face has turned out looking almost as we would have expected. There are clearly an awful lot of weapons around at this time, but I do wonder how many of them were for use and how many of them were for show, because there's very little evidence of actual violence, the sort of evidence that we've got from Tor Martin. Now, this shield might give us a clue, because it's very lovely, but a shield is supposed to be something that's for defence. This is made of metal that's only 0.5 millimetre thick. It's beautiful, but it's absolutely useless.
This shield was clearly for display only. But what about all the spears and swords of the time? Was their only purpose to make their owners look good? At Sheffield University, that theory has been severely tested. Sue Bridgeford's test rig consistently simulates the powerful slashing blows of one Bronze Age sword edge against another. And her results lead her to believe that these were indeed very violent times.
We definitely have an impact. That is bowed and I think chipped, which is reasonably what you would expect because this is actually a very hard edge, so it tends to be brittle and bits of metal do come off.
Sue's test samples are made from bronze of the same composition as Bronze Age finds from Britain. And Sue's found evidence of identical damage on the edges of real Bronze Age weapons.
Sue, I've always had the impression with beautiful bronze swords like this that they were mainly just for show rather than being used. But are you saying that you've got evidence that they have been used in anger?
Oh, the evidence is on the swords themselves. As you can see on the damage to the edge here, it's got a couple of tears there. But most of the thing is just a distortion of the blade.
And is this the sort of evidence that you found on the experimental blades that you've made?
Yeah. All the angled blows gave this sort of distortion. And those are the ones that you get most commonly when you're actually fighting with swords.
How many of the swords that you've looked at have got this sort of damage?
I've looked at about 600 odd swords, and at least 50% have damage that is consistent with the experimental replication of how they would have been used in sword fighting, sword to sword.
I mean, do you think all Bronze Age weapons were probably used then? They weren't just made for show?
I think a very small minority were used for show. The vast majority were made as serious weapons. You know, they were used to kill people.
There's something else we can find out about these weapons, where they were made, and for that we need to look at the composition of the bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. There were around 10 copper mining districts active in Bronze Age Britain, and one of the most impressive is in North Wales. The rocky headland known as the Great Orme is riddled with the tunnels of ancient mines, where the copper, unusually, is mildly radioactive.
This is the malachite, the copper carbonate.
The copper ore shines green in the rock. Tin, the other main ingredient of bronze, was found in Devon and Cornwall. Grains of heavy black tin ore can still be captured today by panning moorland streams.
Right. That's what they were after, is it?
That's what they were after.
So what is the composition of our Tor Martin spearhead? What can it tell us? I took it to Oxford University's Department of Materials for assessment. Peter Northover will compare the chemical composition of our spearhead with a database of over 10,000 samples of ancient bronze to find out when our spearhead was made and where the raw materials came from. Peter and his colleagues have shown that at different times in history, bronze has been made with varying ratios of copper and tin, as well as nickel, arsenic and other trace elements. They've also pinpointed the characteristic proportions of elements that identify different copper and tin mines across Europe.
Low cobalt, so it's nothing to do with the southwest of England.
He can now compare our spearhead with the samples in his database.
The results tell a nice, coherent story, pretty well tracking the object from when it was copper right to when it was a spearhead stuck in somebody's back.
So how old is it?
I think originally we're looking at something like the 14th century BC. The other key point of the composition is two impurities, nickel and arsenic, which you can trace across quite a large part of northwest Europe, origin roughly eastern Switzerland, western Austria.
You're talking about Switzerland though, but this seems bizarre when you've got these huge copper mines here and they're bringing copper all the way from Switzerland.
Certainly there is no way it could come from the Great Orme, because the Great Orme just doesn't have that level of nickel and arsenic in it. We believe the copper was mined and smelted in the Eastern Alps, eastern Switzerland, western Austria, refined, made into bronze with tin, and then made into tools, weapons, ornaments, and then traded in stages across France, traded as scrap across the Channel, and then up to Tourmartin area, and it may well have been made into a spearhead somewhere relatively close to Tourmartin.
So they're importing scrap bronze,
Yes.
not the actual copper then?
Scrap bronze, rather than trading off into these damp and windswept parts of the British Isles, just to buy some scrap from the guy down the road.
So the bronze that ended up in the Tourmartin spearhead came to Britain as scrap metal from mainland Europe about 1400 BC. This isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. In 1974, close to Dover Harbour, divers discovered the sunken wreck of a Bronze Age ship that was carrying over 60 kilos of well-worn bronze tools from France to be traded as scrap in Britain. So the people in Tourmartin weren't living in isolation. They were part of a vast trade network that spread across Europe, a network that supplied scrap bronze to be reworked into fighting weapons. There were 5 burials, but most unusually 3 of them, including the one I'd helped to excavate, each had a pewter chalice and paten, the ceremonial cup and plate used for communion. Whoever this man was, I was sure that he had a fascinating story to tell.
This is the best preserved burial, the one that's in this stone-lined kist. It's almost like a coffin, but made up of different slabs of stone. It looks even clearer now, the burial that partly lay on the top of it's been removed, and it all seems to be here. The idea of a kist is that you build a grave and line it with slabs of stone, but normally these are much earlier. In medieval times you've usually got a complete stone coffin, but not in this case. I don't know, it's difficult to say whether it's dirt, but I think that a number of these vertebrae look as if they've fused together, which is a sign of degenerative disease. That's what it looks like. I mean, this looks like a solid mass here rather than a series of separate bones. I mean, this should be about 3 or 4 separate vertebrae, but it's one solid fused mass right the way through there. Okay, thank you. Right, now if we can sort of pack it round. Well, the last bits of this burial need to come out, and there's just the skull left and also a very nice chalice right next to it. And of course the skull seems to be lying partly over the chalice, which does seem in very good condition, and the stem of it seems to be coming down here with the foot resting on top of this stone.
The chalices, lifted out in blocks of soil, looked as if they might be our most important clue.
Oh, right, okay. Start that in.
Now, the burial I've just helped to excavate is very unusual for Meet the Ancestors because I think it's the first time that we've been certain of the profession of the person in the grave. Because that man was buried with a pewter chalice, and that means that he was a priest. But when did he die? And what was his role in the history of this cathedral and of the city? By the end of the dig, we were sure that the burials were medieval. But the ground level around the cathedral had been lowered by some 3 feet during the Victorian restoration work, so it was hard to tell precisely in which century the burials had taken place. But there were some clues. Stone kists were used throughout the Middle Ages, but the chalices suggested the 13th century, as did the pottery recovered from around the graves. I was most intrigued by that strange spinal deformity in the burial that I'd worked on.
It's what we call DISH for short, and that stands for diffuse, meaning it's affecting the whole body, idiopathic, which is a horrible term but means we don't know what causes it, skeletal, meaning affecting the skeleton, hyperostosis, meaning bone formation. So these people with DISH are bone formers.
But is it something that happens with age? I mean, how old was this chap when he died?
I think he's certainly over 50. He's elderly.
Yeah.
And yes, it's a condition that affects older people, older males. And in archaeological populations, it's been found in high frequency in monastic populations.
Really?
Yes, generally speaking.
So is this image of the fat jolly friar then actually true? I mean,
maybe it is.
Is there a higher incidence of obese people in monasteries associated with cathedrals at this time?
Be nice.
There were other features of the man's skeleton which suggested a long and rather painful life. Dish had constricted his neck, making swallowing difficult. There were signs of infection in his shins. His teeth were rotted and covered in plaque. Even his heel had been injured. This poor chap, I mean, he seems to have got problems everywhere. His neck, his back, his knees, his lower legs, and even his heel. I mean, it's literally head to foot.
Yeah, and even in the left foot, right here on the big toe.
Oh no, he's not got a toe problem as well. So it really is head to toe.
Yes, it is, yeah. Right,
poor chap. There were further puzzles. One of the skeletons was of a child, aged between 7 and 9, and showing signs of a nasty eye infection. And one of the other chalice burials revealed evidence of a lifestyle surprising for a priest.
But if you look at his head, he's got a little dint in it. See? There.
Oh yes.
Little depression.
So is that an injury?
Yeah, I think somebody's either hit him on the head or he's fallen onto something or something's fallen on him.
Right.
But along with that, we've got 3 rib fractures.
Oh, all on the same side?
1, 2, 3. Yeah, and they're all healed. It may be that these 2 injuries are contemporary. So they happened at the same time because they are very well healed.
A bang on the head and cracked ribs?
Yeah. So you could interpret that 2 ways. You could say, well, somebody's hit him on the head and in the ribs, leading to those injuries, or he's fallen and hit his rib cage and his head at the same time, and he's sustained those injuries.
I went to see the British Museum's Iron Age curator, J.D. Hill.
One of the odd things about this gallery is that it's full of objects from graves, and when people think of a typical Iron Age burial, you often see pictures of this, the Welling Garden City burial.
This looks pretty wealthy to me.
This is an extremely wealthy burial, but the bulk of Britain from 1000 BC onwards, we don't actually find enough dead people to represent the population. The funerals in Iron Age Britain for the bulk of the population involves not putting dead people in the ground.
But this is a whole skeleton, and a whole skeleton buried in a pit with a load of rubbish. So how do we explain that?
There must be something about the way that person died or who that person was, which was special, which marked them out to being buried, disposed of potentially, in a very, very different way than anyone else living in that village or community. Are they people who have something about them in terms of their personality, perhaps in terms of their physical appearance, which marks them out as somehow different? Are they some person who's met their death in a strange and unusual way? Are they suicides? Are they struck by lightning? But the other possibility is that these are not people who've died of natural causes or of illness or of accident, but these are people who have been deliberately killed by their community sacrifices.
So why was our person marked out as being special? Perhaps there's a clue in the bones, which have now been examined by Durham University's Charlotte Roberts.
I think this is a woman. I think...
Why do you say you think that it's
Well, we've got a skeleton here that is not fully mature. And here in the pelvis, if you look at the sciatic notch, it's quite wide, which you'd expect in a female, but the pelvis isn't totally developed and fused, so it's a bit dangerous to say it's positively female.
I thought that we were probably dealing with, what, a teenager? Somebody of that sort of age
I think she's
here?
about 16, 17.
So is there anything on the skeleton that would tell us how she died?
Absolutely nothing, but a lot of things that would cause people's death would be related just to soft tissues. The only thing that I can see on the skeleton that gives an indication of her health are on these ribs. And what we've got here is some bone formation down here and also along here. It's actual new bone that's been formed as a response to inflammation. It could be pleurisy, inflammation of the pleural cavity. It could be an infectious disease like tuberculosis. It could be the result of pneumonia. It could be the result of chronic bronchitis.
And there's no way that we can tell whether or not this girl was sacrificed or died a natural death?
No, well, there's certainly nothing here to tell me that.
So the bones give no indication of why this girl was special. But perhaps there's something about her appearance that's out of the ordinary. At Manchester University, her face is going to be reconstructed by Caroline Wilkinson.
Well, this is the girl's skull from Bourton-on-the-Water. You can see some of it's missing, part of the nasal bone is missing, but the majority of the skull is intact. There is some asymmetry in the lower jaw. You can see when you view it from the front that the centre of her chin is heading off to her right, although her teeth are in a central position. The asymmetry has to be quite marked on the skull for it to show up noticeably on the face. All of us have asymmetrical faces. Her asymmetry isn't marked enough that she would be particularly unusual. You can see here there's quite a lot of peg showing above the muscle, which is where the subcutaneous fat will be held in the face. So this layer of clay represents these buccal fat pads that fill out an adolescent face and make it appear more chubby and more smooth-skinned and rounded than an adult face.
The excavation was already well underway when I joined the team. The project leader, Graham Young, told me they'd located 6 human burials. One of them looked like a child.
Well, it's obviously a youngster, isn't it?
Yeah, the bones haven't properly fused and it's actually quite small. It's interesting that on one side it's actually beautifully preserved, but where the body seems to be lying on and in the clay, which must be very destructive to the bones, because where its hand's been excavated from around it, it's actually in very good condition.
I could see that most of them were buried in a way that seemed to suggest that they'd been Christians, on their backs with their feet pointing to the east. 2 of them were buried in stone-lined or kist graves, a method of burial thought to date from the early Christian period between 500 and 600 AD. At least, this was the theory that the team were working on. But there did seem to be some inconsistencies in these seemingly Christian burial methods.
What's that? I mean, that looks like animal bone.
It is. I mean, we've got part of what is a sheep or goat jaw, and this I think is part of a rib, but that's much bigger, and I think that's cattle, that's beef I think there.
But I mean, they can't just be accidental, can they? I mean, is that what it looks like? I mean, is it a food offering?
Well, we have got small amounts of animal bone out of some of the other grave fills, but this is so closely associated with the burial. And the fact that there's two pieces together as well, yeah, I think it quite possibly is deliberately placed in with the body.
That's not very Christian, is it?
It's not, but I think we have to remember that we're dealing with Christianity in a very early period, and exactly what constitutes Christianity, we're not entirely sure at this time.
Right.
And over the next few days, as work continued, we discovered more evidence that puzzled me. Two of the burials turned out to have their feet to the west, the wrong way round for a Christian, and one of them contained some mysterious-looking objects. They looked like lumps of badly corroded metal. One seemed to be a kind of circular object, while the other looked longer and leaner in shape. But burying people with any sort of grave goods is a pagan practice. How do we explain away what appears to be a mixture of pagan and Christian burials that date to between about 500 and 600 AD? Now, I think that the answer lies in the location of Bamborough and in what was going on here about 100 years earlier. Because this, at that time, was a border area, close to Scotland, but still about 50 miles north of Hadrian's Wall. So this area was never really part of Roman Britain, and at that time the people here would have found themselves sandwiched between Roman Christians to the south and pagan natives to the north. The delicate bones we carefully removed from their sandy graves may be able to tell us not only what these people looked like, but when they lived.
This is where we're ready to lift, okay. Right.
But radiocarbon dates obtained from tiny samples of their bones are going to take months, and until these are available, the only clues we have about the date of the burials are the corroded lumps from one of the graves.
That's come out much better than I thought. Now, the thing is that jaw going to stay on? No, that's...
The objects were sent to archaeological conservator Karen Barker in Newcastle. The first thing Karen needed to do was to x-ray the lumps to see what they contained. Once developed, the x-ray plates clearly revealed the outline of a small buckle. But the other lump was far less clear, possibly the tip of a knife. So would removing the centuries of corrosion reveal any more? Using a mixture of compressed air and aluminium oxide powder, Karen cleaned the puzzling object and exposed a small iron knife blade, broken in two, but still quite recognisable. The buckle was incredibly delicate. Virtually all the iron had disappeared, and it was now little more than rust in the shape of the object. Unfortunately, this buckle could belong to almost any period in history, but the other object proved to be far more informative.
It's the knife that's a really useful clue, because the angle of the tip here, the shape of the blade, this tells us that this is typically Anglo-Saxon. It was made sometime between about 650 and 750 AD. But if the knife is Anglo-Saxon, then does that make our people Anglo-Saxon too? And if they are, then where did they come from?